Welcome to Watchtower History. In the St. Paul Enterprise, there's a letter where Charles Taze Russell wrote to William Jennings Bryan while he was Secretary of State. The St. Paul Enterprise published this letter on June 6, 1913. This letter was not in the Watchtower until April 1st, 1915. So the Enterprise had this a couple years previous. And there are several articles where Watchtower either quotes from Bryan or puts entire articles from Bryan in their periodicals. In this letter to Bryan, Charles Taze Russell was suggesting that they sell the Philippines to Japan, and that in doing so, they might avert trouble with the Japanese that was already starting to brew at that time. And since Bryan was so highly influential in government and politics, the hope was that Bryan would like the idea that was suggested. And of course, they didn't do it. And of course, they had trouble, just a couple decades later in World War II. The influence of Bryan started much, much earlier. You could see it's in the earlier writings with Charles Taze Russell. But the ideas that Bryan was suggesting, the ideas that Bryan was teaching, were not accepted under the Russell presidency as much as they were under the Rutherford presidency. As we're going through all this documentation, we could see these very anti-Semitic ideas, anti-Semitic conspiracy theories of Bryan, some of the financial ideas of Bryan. Rutherford was bringing into Watchtower doctrine, into Watchtower theology, and making it a part of where he thought and what he thought the Watchtower should be teaching at the time. And this, of course, stems back 30 years previous to when Rutherford was literally campaigning for William Jennings Bryan before he was ever a part of the Watchtower.
And I've said this before. People look at the world now, the World Wide Web, what we've got going on. This was the world. What we're showing here on screen literally was the news. What you got in the newspaper, what you got from Watchtower, what you got from all that. So we're talking Bryan was a big player. Rutherford was a big player in his own way of things. So the small world that you're in was tying in, and you could see Rutherford picking what was going on right out of it, and sadly becoming part of it, which is the worst part of it, especially if they're telling everybody to be no part of the world, join me. But what was he doing? He was following the newspapers, Bryan, and all these other Ford, all these other ideas, and incorporating them into the Watchtower.
He was bringing those political ideas from William Jennings Bryan and making that a part of the Watchtower. As much as they claimed to be neutral, they were taking the politics of the day and making that a part of the Watchtower organization.
And creating beasts, doctrines, beliefs, all out of what was happening at the time. And that's why we're bringing all this forward. A lot of the modern day Jehovah's Witnesses have no idea where this stuff came from. This is where it came from. This is not something that came out of the Bible. Oh, this is the UN. Oh, this is Russia. Oh, this came from Rutherford and what was happening, a snapshot of particularly American history at the time. Because you say whatever you want, the Jehovah's Witnesses is not a world religion. Jehovah's Witnesses is an American religion.
With specific American ideas coming from the specific political ideas that were going around at the time. Remember, Rutherford had his talk on militarism. Militarism was a word that was used a lot by William Jennings Bryan, a lot during the time when Rutherford was campaigning for Bryan. And if we look in William Jennings Bryan's newspaper, The Commoner, and he was called the Great Commoner, you could see there's multiple references with this word at the time when Rutherford was there. So Rutherford's borrowing this word, borrowing these ideas, and making that part of his talk during the First World War. And it's interesting that In February 29th, 1916 St. Paul Enterprise paper, there's an article, Preparedness Means Militarism for America. And this article is by Henry Ford, because Henry Ford was preaching against the war. Henry Ford was preaching pacifism. Russell was a great proponent, a great advocate of pacifism. Rutherford was starting to push these ideas until later, as we saw in our neutrality discussion, Rutherford was against the term pacifism. I believe it's because he saw it as a sign of weakness, when really it's a sign of great strength. Exactly the opposite. Why is the St. Paul Enterprise, the secret Watchtower newspaper, printing this article by Henry Ford? Remember, this is Rutherford's lecture title, Militarism. This is what Rutherford had just been suggesting. This is what Rutherford was just pushing as his ideas for how he thought the World War was going to fulfill prophecy. And later, as we've seen, Rutherford's bringing in these ideas of Henry Ford. He's bringing in these ideas of William Jennings Bryan and making that a part of Watchtower's foundation, the very core belief of Watchtower doctrine.
And again, it shows Rutherford's snapshot of the world at the time. And what is amazing is he was fueled by paranoia. He was literally thinking he was in battle with the world, with people were coming against him. They were going to turn on him. And just the title, militarism, is like a trigger word for a man like Rutherford. And you see him in there. It's making Watchtower people, the higher ups, the people in the St. Paul, in the Watchtower writing community, it's entering all from all sides into the organization. And yes, as we discussed with the secret newspaper. Hey, Jeff.
Yeah,
What are you doing?
I'm catching up on my newspaper reading. Only about a century behind. Did you know the Watchtower had a secret newspaper?
Let's tell everybody about it. As we discussed with the secret newspaper, St. Paul Enterprise was part of Watchtower indirectly. They were all, until Rutherford got rid of it because he couldn't absolutely control it. Very interesting point in history, and it's all whitewashed and forgotten.
This is that secret newspaper Rutherford called fake news because they were a little too independent and he wanted control. And eventually, he poisoned the well and had them shut down by having their support from Watchtower members withdrawn. And it was this paranoia that Rutherford brought into the very foundation of his roadmap. Rutherford's roadmap to enduring persecution was this paranoia. It was these paranoid conspiracy theories that he was making a part of Watchtower theology, a Watchtower doctrine, a very direct part of Watchtower itself. And as we've shown, his roadmap to enduring persecution, these conspiracy theories that he made a part of Watchtower theology, that he made a part of Watchtower doctrine, was used as evidence that, oh, we're being persecuted, so we have to be the chosen ones? When in many cases, he brought about that persecution on himself and took the persecution meant for the Jews, took the persecution that was meant for those Bible students previous who had believed in those Zionist hopes for Israel, and applied it to himself when it had nothing to do with what Watchtower was teaching at that time.
You hit the nail on the head. He created the evidence. Another word for that would be, in the police world, if you plant evidence, fabricated evidence. So he fabricated the evidence of what was going on in the world as proof of his own ideas. And people believed it. People today still believe it. It's funny, though, how the governing body, tries to distance themselves from. They still keep the core. Okay, he created prophecies that they still believe. They're still rooted in Rutherfordism. The whole idea of cleansing of the sanctuary and everything of how the organization still is tied into Rutherford. However you want to cancel it out or do whatever you want, but that's how deep Rutherford is in this religion, and like you said, the fabrication of evidence to prove they were chosen. He was chosen.
Fabricating the evidence, taking the evidence that was there and making it something completely different than what actually had happened. How is an evidence that is not what happened? How is a historical event or a claimed historical event an evidence of you being the chosen one when it never happened exactly the way that you said? It never happened the way that you said. On the 26th day of March 1919, the Society's officers were released from prison. And late of the same evening, many of the consecrated assembled at Bethel and other places on the earth to give praise to God and to our Lord Jesus Christ. The next day, the 27th of March, plans began to be laid to reorganize the work. This did not escape Satan, but doubtless angered him. He and his earthly agencies would have, without question, destroyed the remnant of Zion on earth, but were prevented from doing so by the Lord's providences. So Rutherford's stating here in the article, it was on the 26th day of March, 1919, that they were released from prison. And they didn't start the work, or as he says here, the thinking about the work, until the 27th of March, 1919. However, when you look at the April 15th, 1919 Watchtower and the April 1st, 1919 St. Paul Enterprise, it says that they were released on bail on March 21st, 6 days previous. So in this article, this whole interpretation is based around Rutherford's being released from prison. And he's saying that they were released from prison on the 26th day of March, 1919. However, when we go to the primary source, we go back to the Watchtower of the time. If we look at the April 15th, 1919 Watchtower, it states that they were released on March 21st, 5 days previous.
And is there any other outside source of Watchtower that confirms this?
The St. Paul Enterprise of April 1st, 1919 also says it was March 21st that they were released on bail, released from prison. They left March 25th from Atlanta, it says, and arrived in Brooklyn. And it says that they didn't start the work until the 27th, or started thinking about the work till the 27th. All right, so we have a discrepancy here of about 6 days already, because he's trying to make all these literal days actually work. And what he's doing is he's fudging the numbers. 1920 was a leap year. So there's probably 7 days. He's off by a week in order to try and make this work. I see him as basically lying about the date of the release from prison in order to make his new Nation article or interpretation work. Again, how is it an evidence if it never happened as Rutherford claimed? And he built an entire religion out of it.
Or even worse, when you take something like that and then say, oh, it did, but it was invisible.
How do you argue against an invisible idea?
Yeah, right? How can you prove Rutherford wrong when he said, oh, it happened invisibly? And then you've got everybody, yeah, it happened. Yep, invisible. I was there. I know. How do you fight people who think something happened invisibly that isn't recorded in the Bible, especially? But they think it's recorded in the Bible.
And even worse, when those ideas, those conspiracy theories that Rutherford made a part of his religion were based on literal forgeries. And so if you're basing your persecution, if you're basing your ideas on literal forgeries, if there's no absolute real substance for what you're teaching, how does that make your organization the chosen ones of God when it's based on literally nothing that happened, nothing that was true? And what was Russell's opinion of Brian? There are some ideas he liked, but there are a great many things that he did not like. And so we see an example of that in the December 1st, 1908 Views from the Tower, where Russell says, "This will probably mean, at least temporarily, a more favorable outlook for business prosperity than if Mr. Bryan had been elected." So he wasn't really on board fully with Bryan's ideas, not as Rutherford was, as we've seen in the evidence that we've shown so far.
The difference between Russell and Rutherford, Russell knew to keep a distance. Russell observed what was happening in the world and tried to see how it would fit in with Bible prophecy. Rutherford took it, instead of observing from the background, his idea was he was part of it. So Rutherford wanted to take an active part in all that. Russell was just sitting back observing. Yeah, okay, yeah. It's probably better from a business point if that Bryan wasn't elected. Whereas Rutherford wanted to be in it. He wanted to be part of. He wanted to be the organization fighting the beast that was against him. He was part of the politics.
And whether right or wrong, Russell didn't make those politics a part of his theology. That's what Rutherford did. Rutherford made those politics a part of his theology and made that persecution because of those politics, because of those conspiracy theories, a part of his theology, a part of the evidence that the Watchtower organization was a chosen one. And since Rutherford was the one taking the lead of the organization at that time, it was all about him. And that's what he had done. His roadmap not only included the persecution, but it also included everything that Rutherford had did up until that time. From 1914, 1918, 1919, 1922, the Cedar Point Convention, the 1925 Birth of the Nation article. All of those things, everything was centered and revolved around what Rutherford was bringing in to the organization. And a lot of what he was bringing in, as we said already, was related to those conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories that were literal forgeries. So if Watchtower doctrine is based on a forgery, what is it really based on? In the Souvenir Notes of Bible Study Conventions, Nashville, Tennessee, December 26, 1908, and this brother J.A. Parker makes a statement about William Jennings Bryan. He says, "Now that was a great proposition. That was something to tempt a man. The thing that has tempted a great many men. It would tempt many men today. Most men have yielded to that proposition. For instance, let me mention the name of a man who I believe to be one of nature's noblemen, William Jennings Bryan. I believe he is clean a politician and noble a man as we have in the nation. But could he stand a test like that? Why, no. He would jump at a chance like that. William Jennings Bryan is not acquainted with God like Moses was. He does not understand the prophecies like Moses did. He does not know anything about the Lord's purpose even as much as Moses did. And so he has not any faith like Moses had, though I suppose he has a certain degree of faith. William Jennings Bryan has made 3 efforts to become president of the United States, perhaps spending half of his fortune and letting his neighbors and political friends spend as much as they pleased of theirs in his effort to occupy the position he was seeking for 4 years, or at the outside world could not have been more than 8. He would lay down a great many opportunities. He would quit the church so far as attending it is concerned for 10 years if he was given that position. When a man gets full of political ambition, if he is an honorable man, he will do everything that is not dishonest or dishonorable in order to win the place."
Who does that sound like? Who else does that sound like?
Interesting question.
I mean, did Rutherford think, if I got a hold of those printing presses, if I took over the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, if I put my ideas in there, if I led this organization my way, it would be better? That's what they're accusing Bryan of wanting to do with the nation. Well, didn't Rutherford do that with the Watchtower Bible Tract Society and his religion? That's identical, if you ask me.
Or even better, it was a lot of William Jennings Bryan's ideas and conspiracy theories that Rutherford was bringing into the Watchtower theology and doctrine.
Exactly. And that's my point. He did exactly what Parker was accusing Bryant of what he would have done. That's exactly what happened with
Oh,
Rutherford.
the irony.
Yeah. Every piece fits together. If somebody were to watch these videos and then look at the religion, everything fits into piece now. Everything.
It's such a simple thing. Once we realized what we were looking at, where to look, when to look, and what to look at, then the evidence just appeared everywhere. So if you have a disagreement with what we've presented, we'd love to hear your opinion. We'd love to hear that perhaps there's another way to look at this evidence.
If you want to do that, at least send your own documentation of why it would be otherwise. Not just because Rutherford said so, not just because we're Jehovah's organization. That's not just claiming it to be something of God does not provide documentation of what your statements are. We're providing the fact on how the organization came to be, not that it is the organization.
And that it was these ideas of Bryan and Ford that Rutherford took. And there's so much documentation, there's so much evidence for it, especially when they suggest that Henry Ford was right about the Jews in the Watchtower publications, that Henry Ford ought to read Rutherford's book, Vindication, that there would be many things in it that he would like. Very direct references stating exactly where those ideas came from Watchtower itself.
And why would Watchtower want to be part of that anyway?
Exactly. It was those ideas of Bryan, the Populist Party, and Henry Ford that convinced Hitler that there was a worldwide conspiracy of Jews, of Jewish bankers, to control the world, and that in order to save Germany, they had to take this anti-Semitic stance and try to kill all the Jews of the world to protect themselves. I mean, how abhorrent is this? These ideas. And yet these ideas were the very foundation of Watchtower's organization, of Watchtower's doctrine. In the August 1st, 1916 Watchtower, we see again that militarism, that militist word. And this is an article by the Honorable William Jennings Bryan, The Munitions Militarist Conspiracy. And this is evidence that they were watching Bryan during this time period. And that article is published in the May 1916 Commoner magazine of Bryan. They borrowed it from there and printed it into Watchtower.
For the record, that was because of the date, August 1st, 1916. This was when Russell was alive. So Russell was aware of Bryan, which again, the connection between Rutherford, Russell, Bryan, there's a connection there. There's the 6 degrees of separation there is here. Russell put a lot of responsibility. He didn't oversee like Rutherford and put his thumbs on everything going out there. He left, okay, you're my editorial committee, you're my publisher, you're this, and he gave them free reign, provided they weren't printing things that were just absolute, crazy.
And as Professor Jim Penton says, perhaps Russell was a little naive. He trusted people. He tried to pick the best of the best. Rutherford trusted nobody.
Mm-hmm.
Rutherford wasn't that way. He was different. He wanted complete control. He wanted to bring his political ideas, his conspiratorial ideas into Watchtower's theology. And if it wasn't for what they did in the First World War, he would have done it a lot sooner. If they hadn't gone to prison, it would have happened earlier than that. It delayed it a little bit, but it also made him a little more bitter because they're being persecuted. And again, here's a persecution, must prove that we're the chosen ones, must prove that we're on the right track. And as we've seen with all the evidence we've shown so far, we can see some of those ideas early on in Rutherford's career. In 1915, we can see it in the teens. Later on in the teens, we can see it in the early 20s. We saw it when Rutherford's giving a lecture to the Jew. He's bringing up these anti-Semitic tropes, these anti-Semitic conspiracy theories to the Jews. And he wondered why the Jews weren't willing to listen to his message.
And to me, this article right here is just one more piece of evidence of how early on this thought process started in Watchtower, not with Rutherford, but hey, now it's entering. Now it's starting to enter. And again, getting back to Rood, his book, when you show how Macmillan and Rutherford and they just united. I mean, you go back to the will. We're not going to get into it. We had this discussion, but there was no reason for Rutherford to be called to come to Brooklyn after the pastor died. Russell had everything set up, who he wanted to take over the editorial committee, the corporate board of the board, on the members of the board of the corporation. That was all set. That was all laid out what he wanted. This shows right here the thought process why Macmillan and Rutherford would start joining and start moving in the direction they did. Macmillan never stopped Rutherford. There's no evidence of him standing up to Rutherford saying no. We have Fisher doing that. We have others doing that, but not any of the tight-knit ones who wanted Rutherford in there. The pieces of the puzzle just all come together when it's presented non-Watchtower style. When you watch it from Watchtower, Faith in Action, and all their videos and their stories of all this, it doesn't make sense with what the actual history is showing.
And these anti-Semitic ideas, these same anti-Semitic ideas about international Jewish bankers, the Rothschilds, that the Russians, the Populist Party, William Jennings Bryan, Henry Ford, which Hitler borrowed, are the same exact ideas that Rutherford used, as we have shown. The same ones that Rutherford borrowed and made a part of that doctrine. And these are the same ideas that Watchtower was putting into their artwork, just like the Nazis. Such abhorrent ideas being the very foundation of Watchtower's roadmap, of Rutherford's roadmap, of the roadmap to how Watchtower got to where it is today. When those ideas are based on such abhorrent things these ideas that literally killed millions of people, it makes you wonder, does God really have the backing of this organization? Is he really backing it? Or is there something more nefarious going on? And as we've mentioned many times before, a lot of the ideas Bryan was putting out there, a lot of the ideas the Populist Party was putting out there at the time were based on literal forgeries. Or it's only found in print in those particular newspapers. So here's an example in William Jennings Bryan's newspaper again, The Commoner. And this is volume 2, number 27, Lincoln, Nebraska, July 25th, 1902. And he has this article, Cleveland's Bond Deal. And you can see the Rothschild Morgan name is highlighted here. And when we look that up and we try and find this source of this idea, it only appears in The Commoner. It only appears in newspapers that are quoting from The Commoner. We saw already how those Rothschild conspiracies were brought up in those populist papers at the time and were debunked literally the next day or a couple days later in the newspapers on the other side of town. And there was never once an apology for saying, oh, this came from the London Times, or this came from the London Financial Times, this came from this newspaper on this date. And when they go and check, it's just not there. Or they quote from the Rothschild history book and they add more to it that's not there. When they tell you exactly what book it is, exactly what page, what edition of the book to look at, when you compare the quotes, they're different. If you have to fabricate a quotation that isn't there, or fabricate or forge something, if your ideas are based on a forgery, as Rutherford's were, what value do the ideas really have?
I could start a newspaper right now and make comments of what I think Biden is, or Trump is, or any of them, any politician out there, and the Pope, and any career religious political entity out there, make my own opinion. 30 other people could quote it. That doesn't mean what they're saying is true. That just shows they got it from me. Where did I get it from? Did I fabricate it? Did I derive it from outright evidence? Did I get into their financial statements through the bank accounts? Did I get into their personal diaries, statements, videos? So those are things that people have to consider when they're doing their fact checking, the source of the information.
And if you had said, I got the idea from this newspaper on this date, on this page, in this article, and you quote from the article, and when I go back and check the article and it's not exactly the same, that you've added some into it, you've literally forged it. That's what a lot of these ideas that Rutherford was bringing in from Bryan, from the Populist Party that he was involved in, from Ford, they were based on literal forgeries. So again, we're going to ask the question we've asked many, many times already. If Watchtower's doctrines were based on forgeries, on conspiracy theories, on politics.
And to help it sink in,
what are they really based on?
The Nazis proved it to be a forgery. So when the Nazis are proving something a forgery as something they wanted to be true, but yet actually admitted is not true, and Rutherford's accepting it, I mean, you need to stop and think what you are involved in. You really do. Whether you're a Jehovah Witness or thinking of getting into it. Well, the religion itself became part of a conspiracy while it's claiming everybody else is a conspiracy.
It's exactly what you said. The United States Congress, the Nazis, Hitler, Goebbels, even Ford, the Russians, the Tsar himself, they all said it was a forgery, based on a forgery. To be fair, Rutherford also thought the protocols were a forgery. Yet at the same time, exactly like Hitler, Goebbels, Ford, he still used the ideas in his writings, in the artwork, and based upon them, his whole prophetic scheme and understanding of international Jewish bankers controlling the world, commercial Jews, as he called them, and so forth. And again, we have to ask if the ideas that are the foundation for your doctrine are based on literal forgeries. What are your doctrines based on? Is there any validity to the ideas that you're trying to present? Another example is found in the volume 5, number 31 of the Commoner, where there's a statement, a supposed quotation, that the Rothschilds were only to marry other Rothschilds, incest, basically. And when looking up this statement, it doesn't appear in the newspapers. It doesn't appear in, other than the Commoner, it doesn't appear in any books at the time. I mean, what kind of evidence for your conspiracy is there if you have to fabricate it, if you can't state where it's coming from? And as we saw, that's what the Populist Party was doing. That's what Bryan was doing. That's what Ford was doing. That's what Hitler was doing. That's what Rutherford was doing by making these ideas a part of the very foundation of Watchtower's doctrine.
It's a small world, and close are the 6 degrees of separation.
Remember the phrase big business that Rutherford liked to use, commercial Jews, very similar to Ford's international Jew. But big business was a term used by Bryan in his Commoner, used by Bryan during the time period Rutherford followed him closely. And he links this phrase, Bryan links this phrase, big business, with the Jewish Rothschilds, with the Jews, with the Jewish bankers, just as Rutherford did years later when he made these conspiracy theories a part of Watchtower's doctrine.
So then I have a question, Jeff. Rhetorical question, of course. Think about this. So did Rutherford start the Jehovah's Witnesses, or did Bryan? Think about it. Did William Bryan start the Jehovah's Witnesses? Indirectly. Because when you look at what Rutherford, who he mimicked, even dressed like, and then you go back, as we've shown other quotations, other ideologies, ye are my witnesses, everything coming out of it. Bryan indirectly started a religion in the United States in addition to his political movement that he started.
Not only did Bryan influence, and the Populist Party influence Rutherford later on, but they also influenced Ford, who was a member of the Populist Party. And Ford, of course, influenced Hitler. And those basic core ideas of these international Jewish bankers being the catalyst for what Hitler did in World War II and the Holocaust. It's abhorrent. It's just absolutely disgusting. It makes me sick just to think of what these ideas did. And it makes me sick to think that these ideas are the very basis for Watchtower theology.
But think about it. Bryan, indirectly, Bryan had an integration, an initiation, an inception, part of the creative process and the evolution of the Jehovah's Witnesses.
Through his influence on Rutherford.
It's amazing. And again, I keep emphasizing, because I if I could get anybody to understand anything, and what we're trying to do in this is look at the snapshot of the time. You have to understand the times. This was what was going on here. This was in the news. This was everything. This was, if you weren't in that, you were a farmer. You were a factory worker. You had no internet to go about on your thing. You didn't have hobbies like they do today, the leisure. You were watching this. This was going on in the world. Wars, not just wars, world wars starting to take process and escalating into. So this is what Rutherford glommed onto and became. This is your religion.
This is why we had to read over 100 history books. This is why we had to familiarize ourselves with that history. This is why we had to. This is why once we found what we found, that we had to go through and read everything that we read before, because now we knew what to look for. Now we knew when to look. Now we knew who to look at and how to look at it. And once we knew that, then the evidence appeared everywhere. And so literally the evidence is so overwhelming that it took this long to tell the story. We had the beginning of our story with their persecution in Nazi Germany, how the Jehovah's Witnesses stood firm. We also showed how they backed down, how the Jehovah's Witnesses have not been entirely truthful with their history on this period. And the reasons why they were persecuted was not because they were Jehovah's organization, but because they were previously Zionists, that they previously loved the Jews. Once we saw those things, we then had the middle of our story of how Rutherford was interpreting these prophecies to make it all about the Watchtower organization, to make it all about him, because he was the one taking the lead of the organization. These were all his ideas. These are all his ideas that he was taking from his politics, from his conspiracy theories, from his paranoia. And now we have the end of our story to wrap it all up in this, in our explanation here of where these ideas came from, what they were, who they came from, and how the modern Watchtower came to be.
And with that said, once you come to the end of our series here, if you were to go back to our first video, starting in the trumpet blasts and all that, and start all over again, you would see things in a whole different light and understand how all the sheep and the goats, all cedar, a lot of it would make a lot more sense, and you have a better understanding how Rutherford, how his mind thought.
That paranoia was the foundation of Watchtower doctrine. Not only was Bryan in a lot of the newspapers, he was in a lot of the political cartoons of the time period as well. There's so many examples of the artwork and the political cartoons with Bryan as a subject and Bryan's ideas as a subject. And when you look at some of these, you'll recognize some of the similarities in them to what Watchtower was putting in their magazines at the time period. In this article in the Free Press for December 16th, 1897, you can see that the Populist Party was also stating that William Jennings Bryan is the man appointed by God to lead this people out of the slough of despond. This wasn't just something that Rutherford was saying. This was something that was popular in the Populist Party. And this is where Rutherford got the idea from.
Okay, but take that one step further. If Rutherford is believing that, he's following the thought process of what was going on in the time. He's following what was in the air, the sentiment, the feelings, the times. Like people say, the 60s was a special time. It was an age of innocence and all that. Okay, what is that age? He was in there literally following that whole ideology. Yeah, he's the chosen one, appointed by God. Rutherford said the same thing.
And later on, when Rutherford considered his replacement theology based on those anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that he originally learned from the Bryanites, the Populist Party, Rutherford started to think, well, if this is God's chosen organization, and I'm the one leading the organization, I'm the chosen one. I'm the appointed one. That was a very natural progression for him to go.
So, Brian, you need to follow me, not me follow you. Literally.
While Bryan is Secretary of the State in the White House under President Wilson, the racist film about the Ku Klux Klan was brought to the White House by Wilson's daughters in 1914 so that they could watch it. President Wilson and D.W. Griffith, who made the film, knew each other for years. They had gone to school together. This racist pro-Ku Klux Klan film was made by one of Wilson's friends. If you haven't seen our Ku Klux Klan discussion, be sure to check it out because it shows clearly that Watchtower was not really that opposed to the Klan, and that they even sold radio time to the Klan on Watchtower radio stations in Canada. The irony of all of this is that when they showed the film at the White House, they showed it in the East Room. The East Room was where President Lincoln's body was laid out for viewing after his assassination.
Maybe that's why they did it. You don't know how the minds of men think.
And of course, after hearing about this, D.W. Griffith made a title card showing a quotation from President Wilson about the Klan. After this made the news, Wilson put out a statement that he did not endorse the birth of the nation, but seeing some of the statements that Wilson made, there was some racism there. And of course, there was some racism there with Bryan and the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that they were pushing in the Populist Party. That influenced Rutherford. Seeing that Bryan saw the birth of the nation at the White House, it's interesting, if not ironic, that Rutherford's 1925 article, which changed everything for Watchtower, was called The Birth of the Nation. Remember that Rutherford's article, The Birth of the Nation, is based on his racist theology, where he's trying to get rid of the Jews, his replacement theology. And why is he trying to get rid of the Jews? It's because of those anti-Semitic conspiracy theories he learned when he campaigned years before for Bryan and the Populist Party. This is speculation, mind you, but seeing the similarly titled film and the Watchtower article with Bryan's connection in there, it's quite possible.
Coincidental. It's what they call coincidental speculation, if you want to give it a title with that. The odds of it, you know, phrases that go on like it's cool. Okay, that lasted for years. Keen, neat. They spring up and they go away. But when it's happening, you hear it on the TV, you hear it on the radio, you see it in the kids in the schoolyards. That's the same thing right there. They're all taking these catchphrases of the day and repeating them. When you follow the history, Bryan, Ford, Hitler, Rutherford, too many common denominators just keep on springing up. And again, the article birth of a nation, right when Birth of the Nation right when Birth of a Nation is out there. I mean, there's just too many coincidences to deny, or at least, at the very least, not question and investigate the source and of all these things.
Brian was so popular with the public that someone even wrote a song about him after he died.
Listen now, all you good people, and a story I will tell about a man named Mr. Bryan, a man that we all love so well. He believed the Bible's teaching, and he stood for what was right. He was strong in his convictions, and for them he'd always fight. Now he's gone way up in heaven, where he'll find an open door. But the lesson that he taught us, it will live forevermore. The good folks had their trouble down in Dayton far away. Mr. Bryan went to help them, and he worked both night and day. There he fought for what was righteous, and the battle it was won. Then the Lord called him to heaven, for his work on earth was done. If you want to go to heaven, when your work on earth is through, you must believe as Mr. Bryan. You will fail unless you do.
Looking back on it, we can see that was quite a reprehensible thing, but I don't think they saw that at the time. I think they saw it as politically expedient. And as time goes on, culture changes, attitudes change. You can look back at the history and see how things that once we thought were good things no longer are. And if Watchtower doctrine is based on these kind of things, if Watchtower doctrine is based on these things coming out of the anti-Semitism, coming out of that replacement theology, coming out of these politics, maybe that explains why there was so much anti-Semitism in Rutherford's writings. I believe that's why it explains that there was so much anti-Semitism in Rutherford's writings.
And again, I've said this before, people don't realize the Jehovah's Witnesses today is Rutherford. You're following a man. They wanted make it seem like it's an organization, but Rutherford was the organization that fulfilled the prophecy that now the governing body's taking over, doing the same thing Rutherford is doing. So you're still following Rutherford because they're in power because Rutherford put them in power.
Remember, when the European editions had added Masons to the protocols. Now, the Nazis had said it was the Masons, the Jews, and the Bible students. Again, as these keep going out, going into other countries, other languages, it keeps getting modified. Why didn't Ford say that? Because he was a Freemason. For me, it's very, very ironic that while there are conspiracies about the Bible students being Masonic, here we have a direct connection. If indeed these ideas that Rutherford's pursuing have origins in a lot of these Ford conspiracy ideas, remember, we had documents in the Watchtower literature stating Henry Ford was right about the Jews. If that's true, here's a direct link to suggest that some of these ideas originated from an individual who was a Mason. We're going to have a deep dive into possible Masonic connections, the pyramid, the winged sun disk, and all of that, the cross and crown. We're going to get into a lot of that in a future discussion. That's another discussion for another time. But the point here and the summarization that we want to get to is that these conspiracies that Rutherford was bringing in, this replacement theology, this anti-Semitism, was not only anti-Semitic, I believe it's truly anti-Christian, anti-scriptural, satanic, hate speech. Seeing the links to these things really saddens me, especially to see how millions of Jews were killed, even these Jehovah's Witnesses who believed in some of these things. Again, all of these agree on all these various points, on all the various conspiracies that they were pushing forward. The protocols from Russia, Henry Ford, Hitler and the Nazis, and Judge Rutherford.
So now, with all this evidence pointed out, both Jeff and I realize there's going to be people who will either follow the facts, the history, trace the documentation. There will be those who don't want to acknowledge the facts, the documentation. Those who will create their own opinion of what was said here, whether it was or not. And that's where it leaves it up to you as an individual. Do you want to take the baton of this like Rutherford did? He added the Catholics to this conspiracy. Do you want to add the Jehovah's Witnesses to this? Do you want to add Rutherford, Russell, whoever to this? Or do you want to take the facts themselves and what history and what is presented and just understand it for what it really is? That's completely your choice.
Well said. Thank you, Paul.
Well, we still have a little more work to do. I can't remember what we said our next discussion following this will be. We'll think about that, I guess, and then see what we should after this. And thank you, Jeff.
And we're going to pull on some of these threads and find some of these things in future discussions as well. And so stay tuned to the channel, like and subscribe. And thank you for the encouragement. We really appreciate it. Thank you again, Paul. This has been a very fascinating discussion. Thank you all for watching. Like and subscribe. Leave some comments. Let us know what you'd like to see in the future. Get a whole story, not just from the Watchtower's perspective, but from all the various splinter groups. What were they saying? So until next time, keep reading.